the footnotes down on the bottom of the page is where they discuss which variants were perhaps in effect, which ones were really important, and why they chose the ones that they chose. And they're going to be different. Nestle Aland is going to have a whole lot more detail to it. I'm sorry, a lot more detail in that it's going to list almost every variant that you can find for each decision that they have to make, whereas the UBS spends more time with less variants, but giving more information as to why they chose what they chose. All right. And that's where we are today with the Greek New Testament, and how it is that we've gotten to the Greek New Testament that is used almost universally. The Nestle Aland text is almost used universally by scholars. You know, if I'm ever quoting or anything, which I don't, because it's above my head anyway to do that kind of stuff. But that would be what I would use if I were to do any translating. I'm going to this one. This is the current text that we have. So that brings us up to date in that regard. The question, though, perhaps that you didn't know that you should be asking is, how do we get to this particular text? Because once again, do we have that autograph? What are the autographs again? What's that? Yep, the autographs are the original writings from the hands of the original prophets who wrote them. They're gone. We just don't have them. So our job is to try to get as close to what they had written, using all of the resources that we have at our disposal, trying to get as close to what we think those autographs were as we possibly can. And that is the field of study of textual criticism. It's kind of a daunting type of a word. You know, we're definitely getting into heavy jargon type of language. You know, manuscripts, criticism, things like that. You know, codices, all these types of things. And that's just going to be the way that it's going to be, because textual criticism is a now large field of study. I mean, this is a huge part of biblical studies. It's riveting. I'm sure that all of you guys can imagine how incredible it would be to spend your entire life just analyzing tiny little scripts of paper day after day after day, right? Does that sound like everybody's idea of a good time? Yeah. It takes a certain type of person probably to do this type of thing, and I'm glad that those people exist, because I am not that person. Yeah, Vicky? No, I believe they're American scholars. I could be wrong, but that's what I have in my head. So it's a really good question. My guess, if it's not American, you know, German scholars are a lot of those things that we've been looking at. So it's a good question. Maybe I should just say I don't know. I'd have to look them up. All right, with textual criticism, the first thing, by the way, because this is a field of study, I could not find a good just flow of thought where just one thing works into another, works into another, works into another. I've done the best that I can, but some of these things are going to kind of feel disjointed, and hopefully at the end will come together in a little bit. But this is what we're going to talk about first. Here's our jargon: text types or text families. As people pour through, and I'm going to add some more dots on here, just, I don't know, add more dots. As people, you have all of these that have come out over time, and just imagine that they're getting exponentially more as you go away from the original. So as you are moving through here, we have all of these manuscripts out there. As they start going through the manuscripts, they begin to realize that when they come up with certain variants, they find groups that have the exact same variants. That if there's a choice, these groups kind of do the same thing. And they say, well, that means they're probably coming from a certain source. Does that make sense? So they group them into families, is what they call them. Different classes, different groups. And so you may have a group over here. Well, here are the main ones that they have. First of all, the Byzantine family. There are 3, maybe 4. The Alexandrian family, the Western family, and then the Caesarean family. And all of these names come from where you typically find these groupings. The Byzantine are up in here. Byzantium then was Constantinople, now Istanbul there. Down here, Caesarea, where you had the Caesarean family, Alexandrian from Alexandria, Western, Rome, really, but it kind of Italy and Spain and such, you see those coming up. So you can see that it's a lot geographic. Here's the thing about these families, though. The Byzantine family seems to be a much later text type. The large majority of these manuscripts are Byzantine. That means they follow the Byzantine flow. Typically speaking, when there are variants, they will group together, and they're later. So the vast majority of manuscripts that we have are going to be Byzantine. Why is that? Because the vast majority of manuscripts that we have are later. And, with the Byzantine, it kind of won the day eventually. And some of these other ones just you don't see after a certain point. But you don't see Byzantine before a certain point either. So that's the Byzantine family. The Alexandrian is one of the earliest. That's the one that, like Westcott and Hort, that's the one that they elevated to the highest. The codices tend to take the Alexandrian text type or be part of that text family. The Western is also one of the earliest. You see it pretty early, but the thing about the Western is that as you go out, there's stuff all over the place sometimes. They weren't careful. This seems to have been just one that people would do real quick for missionary type of work, where they're sending somebody out, and you might have a lot of paraphrasing and such that's taking place in these. So they weren't as careful, typically, with the Western ones. And then you have the Caesarean, which may not be its own thing. It has a lot in common with Alexandrian, and maybe it's just a form of the Alexandrian text type. Give me 1 second. I meant to grab another book. It's sitting in here. This is a workbook here by Dan Wallace, who is one of the premier guys in the whole textual criticism field. He is one of the big names. And this is a workbook for a series of lessons that he did back in 2013 at a little coffee shop in Oklahoma City, or Edmond, Oklahoma, that are fantastic. I mean, they will take you through it. If you really want to dig into this and know more about this and sit at the feet of the guy who knows what he's talking about and who's actually very entertaining, he's not dry and boring, he's actually pretty good. We have these. We have these on a flash drive in the resource room. And if you wanted to take that and use that and get some more information, that's available for us. I only have it in the resource room because it's a flash drive, and it's easy to lose. And it was sitting in my office, and I cleaned up my office one time, and I was like, what is this little thing? Oh, yeah, this does not belong in my office. So it's in the resource room now, and I highly recommend, if you are someone who's interested in this type of stuff, he is absolutely fantastic, and we have it, so we can use that. But a lot of this stuff is in here. And this is it's a workbook to go along with those lessons, and it's very, very helpful. So all I'm saying is all of this information, I'm just throwing a ton of it out. Hopefully it's making sense, but I am synopsizing something that is massive. Yeah, Sharon? Yep. No. Yeah, the phrases that are used are not time period phrases. They're location, just geographic is all that they are. Yeah, yeah. This isn't a time frame type of thing. Uh, all we know about the Byzantine family, and well, I think I have it on a slide later, that it doesn't. None of them show up before the 4th century, and it's very sparse until you get to about the 800s or so. And then around the 800s or so, it becomes dominant, especially through the Middle Ages and even beyond. It is definitely one of the earliest ones. Yep, yeah, very good. Very good question. In fact, we'll get into that a little bit here. The earliest Greek manuscripts that we have were written on papyri. Has anybody ever heard of a papyrus before? That's a term that maybe I think most people might be familiar with. They were written on these papyri, and we only have 100, 200 or so fragments, scraps of these dating from that time period. It's not like we're overwhelmed, but there are an awful lot, like I said, that are still sitting in museums or schools back in there, the insides, just waiting for people to pick them up and look through them. Most of the things that people look up and go through are completely inconsequential things, shopping lists or stuff like that. But every now and then they'll pick something up and they'll look at it and they'll say, oh, this is the Gospel of John. Wow, this is huge. But those discoveries are few and far between. But that's the thing. We don't know what we don't know at this point. But every year, it seems there are more things that are taking place. So this is up on the screen, this is a papyrus fragment. I think it's P52. The John Rylands papyrus. It is perhaps the earliest one that we have. Some dated to even late 1st century. Typically, people say about 125 to 150 or so is when this would be dated. And considering if you take John to have written his letters at around AD 90 or so, this is really close to the original. It just has a few verses, though, on each side of it. It's not like it's the entirety of the Gospel of John, but this is the type of thing that we're looking at. Also, the majuscules took over, and that has to do with the form of writing, in which on these, the form of writing is all uppercase lettering. The codices are all majuscules, and here's what we're talking about when we talk about the codices or the codexes. This is a picture of Codex Sinaiticus. Sharon just mentioned this one just a couple minutes ago. This is the one you mentioned, right? Sinaiticus? Yeah, mentioned just a couple minutes ago. This is a picture Dave took from the, this is a British museum, I believe, that has Sinaiticus. Yeah. The British Library, okay. Yep. So here are the major codices that we have. Codex B, called Vaticanus. They date that to around 325 to 350. Sinaiticus, 330 to 360. Alexandrinus is a little bit later, 400 to 440. Codex C, Ephraemi, around 450. We have Codex D, which we talked about before, Béziers, around 400. And then we have one over here. Not that it was discovered over here. They didn't find this, but in Washington, there is Codex Washingtonianus. So it's around 350 to 450. Some people believe that these various codices, at least some of them, might be the very writings that the Emperor Constantine commissioned to. He wanted to have 50 Bibles that were produced and have them disseminated, as the case may be. And given the timing, some people think these might be those very items. So we have these. The thing about the codices, if you'll notice, it looks like a what? Looks like a book. That was not a common thing in that time. They didn't usually write in books. But with Christians, they found this a very convenient way to get all of the writings together into a single thing, bind it in that way, and you can actually transport it, move it, keep it. So this was kind of on the forefront of the way we still do things even now today, in the way that we keep information. So these are codices. Not everything that's a majuscule, by the way, was a codex. I'm not trying to say that. But the major codices that we have were written as part of the majuscules during this time frame. All right, any questions on maybe the codex or majuscules or anything? All right, well, we go from 800, around 800, there's just a sharp change in the way that they're doing Greek texts. Instead of the capital letters, now it's shorthandish with small letters and everything else. This is called the time of the minuscules. So we've gone from major to minor, right? So with the minuscules, I don't know exactly what this is. I just found one, so I could put a picture up there. Dave didn't give me a copy of a minuscule thing, so I blame him. I know, yeah. No, but I really do appreciate, by the way, all of the pictures. Dave has given us some really good pictures for this class that I hope you've noticed we've been using, because they're great. And I could have put Alexandrinus. He gave me that one as well, but I just put one up. So these ruled the day until about the 1600s or so, which is kind of the end of that. Around this time, that's when we're creating, instead of just copying other texts, we're now creating the eclectic text that we talked about during the time of Erasmus. So we're not copying manuscripts and copying manuscripts anymore. Around 1600 is around the time that we begin the process that will eventually become textual criticism, to get back to the original text. So let's talk about textual criticism, and this should be the question that we're all wondering: can you even get what they wrote? Is it possible? Or are we always just going to be left wondering and questioning? There's a guy who's huge in all of this. His name is Bart Ehrman. Anybody ever heard of Bart Ehrman before? All right, he is a huge person in all of this discussion. On the other side, he is trying his hardest to make people believe that it's a fool's errand. There's no way we could ever possibly know what is there. We're trying to get back, sure, but at the same time, such an uphill battle. He says scholars, this is in his book from 2005, misquoting Jesus, scholars differ significantly in their estimates. Some say there are 200,000 known variants. Some say 300,000. Some say 400,000 or more. There are more variants among our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. How many of you all kind of find that shocking? What's a variant, by the way? You find it shocking, okay? What's a variant? Anybody remember that discussion from before? Yeah, Kelly? Well, define it though. What is a variant?
Oh, it's a different translation because it's not exactly the same.
All right. So when you're copying, when you're making your copy, that's exactly right. A variant means that these two copies are different. Something is different, and that is a variant. And we, I think, have a tendency to believe that the Bible just kind of showed up. It was there, right? They copied, it's faithful, all of that. And yet Bart Ehrman wants to let us know, hey, it's not quite that simple. Some scholars say there are 400,000 variants, more variants than there are words in the New Testament. And Miranda's already said that's shocking. Anybody else find that shocking? That's interesting. Even so, the numbering of variants is a little misleading. We'll talk about the different types of variants, as Kelly was talking about just a second ago. But here's the thing about variants. Let's say that this right here you find, and you compare it to this one over here, and it's different. That's a variant. But then there's this one that's copied from here, and it's still different. These are the same, right? But it's different, so that's a variant. And these are all three the same, and it's different from this one, but since they're different manuscripts, you compare it, they're all variants. In other words, you could have 100,000 manuscripts that read one way, and one over here that reads a little bit different. And by their numbering, that's 100,000 variants. Does that make sense? You know, it's a shock value statement that doesn't have the meat that it sounds like it does. Yeah, Dave? Mm-hmm.
With somebody that was, he was bringing up this point about textual variants, and so the interviewer said, well, what do you think the original Bible really said then? He said, well, it says basically what we've got, the text that we have, so it is a shock statement. I mean,
yeah.
It's just a statement that's an artificially inflated numbers that really, don't impact the reliability ultimately of the text.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And we're going to break that down and really look at that. But you're going to see these shock type of statements because these are sensational. By the way, if you want to sell magazines or newspapers or get people to watch your interviews or get YouTube clicks or whatever the case is, do you want to say, hey, look, we've got it right all along? Or do you want the, man, we have missed it for this entire time. New evidence shows that things aren't the way that we thought it was. Which one's going to cause more of a stir? It's the latter, right? It's boring to say, yeah, we pretty much have what we need. So this way of counting variants, that number is going to get thrown out. It sounds shocking. It's a very misleading number. And I think it's important that we understand that. So let's talk about the various types of variants. Dan Wallace spends some time talking about this. These are some categories that he has, and I think that they're very helpful. First of all, you have variants, changes, differences that are viable but not meaningful. That is to say that it very well could work. You could say, okay, this one makes sense, and this difference makes sense as well. But does it change the meaning at all? No. Does that make sense? So it's a viable, but it doesn't change the meaning. You could have some that are meaningful but not viable, as in this text says this text says this over here, and this one's different. You read it, and it really changes the meaning, but then you look at it and say, but there's no way this is what he actually wrote. It just wouldn't make sense. Well, then you have some that are neither meaningful nor viable. And, you know, that's just a category you look at it and you're like, this, from the beginning, none of this actually makes sense. And then you have some types of variants that are meaningful and viable. There are very, very few of these, but there are some. And those are ones that you look at and you say, well, either one of these could be correct, and it changes the meaning of the text. So eventually we'll probably talk about some of those. There are two major ones of those to discuss. So I'm going to give you an illustration because that was a lot of words and you're like, yeah, I don't know. Let's say that we find in a text, Sean ate some pizza. All right? This is probably in one of the Gospels. I'm assuming we just haven't found it yet in some variant. Sean ate some pizza. What if we found a copy that said, Sean ate some pizza? All right. Is it changed? Yeah. Is it possible that it could have been either of those two? Yeah. Does it change the meaning at all? No. Because all we have is a guy named Sean, whether he spells his name S-E-A-N or S-H-A-W-N, ate some pizza, right? So it's a viable change, but it doesn't actually change the meaning. What if we had Sean ate some pizzazz? All right? Now, does that change the meaning? Yeah, it does. That's a totally different statement. Is that viable, though? Would anybody say that someone ate pizzazz? No. So it changes the meaning. It's meaningful, but it's not viable. So that we would probably dismiss that. What about Sean ate pizza? You know, does it, I mean, this one's just you look at it, it's not meaningful, not viable, not, you know, none of those. You just kind of throw that one out. What if, though, you had Sean ate a pizza? Is that viable? Yeah. Does that change the meaning of the text? You've gone from ate some pizza now to a very specific whole pizza pie, right? He ate a pizza. You have changed the meaning that you would get from that text. And by the way, are any of these just absolute glaring, well, some of them are kind of glaring, funny things, but all of these kind of could make a little bit of sense, right? You have homophones in there where you're like, okay, somebody understood the wrong word, things that are close, changing of names, those types of things. Here's the thing, though. Less than 1% of all variants are meaningful and viable. In other words, that category where you're actually maybe might be a little bit concerned with, and you say, okay, this is the one that we need to really dig into and say what makes the most sense. The rest of them you really don't need to spend your time with because they don't change or affect anything. So less than 1% of all the variants that are out there, less than 1% are actually the ones that you would look at and say, all right, let's discuss this one. Does that make sense? You know, they'll throw out large, huge numbers to make you worry and wonder and shock value and make you nervous. But when it comes right down to it, there are actually very, very few that are meaningful and viable. So I think it's important that we remember that. All right, questions on this? Yeah, Sharon?
It says, this is from different editions of Moby Dick. Might describe the rogue in Ahab's boat as either a soiled snake or a coiled snake.
Yep.
To me, the rope is being defined as a snake. So how important is the soil or the coil?
Yeah, and that's a good illustration to use. Dan Wallace, in his thing, he actually takes the phrase, I think it's Jesus loves Mary, and he gives 8 different ways that you could write that phrase in the Greek. And then says, that was just a part, you could probably come up with about 200, I think he said, different ways, because they just do things differently. And I mean, there's just all kinds of things that you could do to create that. So if it's coiled or soiled, that type of scenario, this type of thing. The vast majority, though, are just kind of meaningless. So here's a question, though. Why does that happen? Why would variance actually occur? I'm continuing with, and by the way, it's not just Wallace. I have other books in here. There are other books that we could use. I left one in there I could have brought out. Here's David Allen Black. He's a Greek scholar, knows his stuff. He has just a concise guide to textual criticism. This thing's great. It's helpful. This right here, let's see here, Arthur Patzia, The Making of the New Testament, that I've been referencing and doing some of this work. I picked this thing off the table at our last potluck, just so you guys know. That's where I got this thing, opened it up, Sue had it there, and I've gotten some useful information. There's some good stuff out there to help wade these waters. So you ask the question, why would variance occur? First of all, because of unintentional changes. Things happen, right? Misspelled word, or the wrong word, a homophone, you put 8 instead of 8. Sean instead of Sean. You just kind of, maybe there's a word, a name that has different spellings out there, and so you put the wrong one. Maybe you just misspell a word. Has anybody ever misspelled a word before that you knew how to spell? Has that ever happened? Yeah. Even if you're trying to be careful, do you still misspell words? Yeah, that happens, right? That is life, and sometimes that happens. A lot of times, you can see where they skipped a line, or they doubled a line. If you're reading through and you're just kind of writing, and you get down to the end, what if you have you ever seen in a book where you have the same word at the beginning of 2 lines in a row? And has that ever thrown you off? And you start reading, you're like, oh, that doesn't make sense. Hold on, I need to go back up. Well, that type of thing happens, and if you're just not really paying attention, you're just scribbly writing, sometimes you'll have a line that's done twice. Or sometimes lines get skipped. So you have these unintentional changes. A lot of times, people would write things like in the space up above, or maybe in the margin, write a little bit there, and they'd hand it to the next guy, and the next guy copying would say, why is this written here? Was this written because the previous guy added a note? Or did the previous guy accidentally leave it out and then wrote it in right here? Which one? And how do you know, how do you make sure that you are including the whole Word of God? You put the note in. You don't leave it out in case it's original, right? You put it in. And that way, whether it was or it wasn't, at least it's there. That's the type of thing that would take place. Sometimes there were intentional changes. If you found a misspelled word, you say, well, that's not right, or a homophone, the incorrect one. And you say, well, that's not right. I'll just fix that. And you intentionally change what it is that you're copying because you're trying to make it better. Sometimes you would see them add phrases, and these are probably a lot of times the little written in notes, but there would be some kind of harmonization of a passage where something very familiar in another gospel ends up being slapped into this gospel in a parallel passage. And you say, well, this one should have this last little bit here or that part. Sometimes they would change things because the wording is awkward or weird, and they just needed to do something to make it a little bit easier to understand. So you have these kinds of intentional changes. Here are the rules that are stated for choosing variants. Again, I'm leaning on these guys here. First of all, you might say, why not just simply go with the majority text? We've talked about that one, right? The Byzantine variants are by far the majority. The vast majority are Byzantine. Yet you have no Byzantine manuscript version, no church father before the 4th century writes or quotes anything that matches the Byzantine family texts. It is not really there. And just because it's a majority does not mean it's right. Any little change here can become a major majority down the road. By the way, the King James Version is based on the majority text. At least the translations that it was based on, all of that and their continued updates, they base it off of the majority text. So that's a reason why I say it may not be today the best version to get back to what was originally there. But here are some rules that are used. Generally speaking, go with the harder reading. Go with the reading that makes that doesn't make as much sense or is a little more difficult. That seems weird, doesn't it? Kind of counterintuitive. Why would you want to go with the harder reading? Kelly?
When I read something in Spanish, I really have to think about what it means because it was written in a language it's not my first language. So.
Okay, but you have two of them that you can read just as fine. One of them is much smoother than the other.
Well, not if I'm looking for what was like. If you gave me a copy of Don Quixote in English and a copy in Spanish, I'd go with the Spanish, even though it's harder for me. It's a harder read.
Well, bear in mind though, for these people, Greek was their language. They speak Greek. They're copying in Greek. I mean, it's like you copying English to English. Yeah, Dave.
As opposed to the other way around.
Yeah, it's exactly it. There's more likelihood. If you have two readings, one of them's really easy to read and one of them's a little difficult, does it make more sense that someone would say, this is too easy to read, I really need to mess this up a little bit? Or is it more likely that someone would read it and say, wow, I don't understand, let me smooth this out? Which one of those is more likely? It's more likely someone's going to smooth it out, right? So, generally speaking, it's not 100%. Generally speaking, though, you go with the harder reading. The shorter reading is also preferred. We're running out of time, so I'm just going to kind of blaze through these, because you have a tendency to add, not subtract. People don't try to take away from the Word of God, but there are scenarios by which they may add to it in order to be careful. And so over time, especially the Western text is huge compared to the other ones because there was a lot of that adding to, smoothing things out, that type of stuff. The reading that makes sense of the other reading is the preferred one. If you have two and you can explain why one of them is the way that it is, well then that's the one that you'll go with. Let's just go back. I know the nonsensical one that Sean ate some pizzazz. Sean ate some pizza. Can you figure out why someone might accidentally write pizzazz on there? Yeah, they were trying to write pizza, they just got lost in their Z's, right? You know, and that happens from time to time. It's happened to us all, I'm sure. You know, it makes more sense. It makes sense of the other one. So go with the one that at least will give you an idea of why the other one happened. All right, here's why textual criticism matters. We'll close up right here with this. The King James Version was based on translations from the Byzantine family. By the way, in what year for the King James? 1611. A lot has happened since then. Vast amounts of new information, new scholarship concerning New Testament textual studies, a new translation ultimately just simply became necessary. They said, we need something else that can update to the scholarship that we have today. Next time, we're going to take it from there and say, why in the world then does it seem like we have about 1,001 translations out there? And we'll talk about the different translations, some of them, not all of them, what they're trying to do and accomplish. So, all right, I would say, do we have any questions or comments? But that was our bell. We're out of time. So, thanks a lot, guys. Good class.